22 years. That's how long Jerry Hall and Mick Jagger were together. Longer than most rock and roll marriages, longer than most marriages, period. They raised 4 children, appeared on countless red carpets, and were treated by the public as one of music's defining couples. And yet, when their relationship finally ended in a London courtroom, a judge ruled that in the eyes of the law, they had never actually been married at all. That single legal fact, a wedding that wasn't a wedding, sits at the center of one of the more unusual celebrity love stories of the last 50 years. And now, as Jerry Hall approaches her 70th birthday, she's talking about it with more candor than she ever has before. Not with bitterness, but with the kind of clarity that seems to only come with distance. This is her story, and because their lives were so tangled together, his too. Jerry Hall was born in Gonzales, Texas, on July 2, 1956, and by her late teens she was already one of the most in-demand faces in fashion, working steadily through the back half of the 1970s. She modeled in Paris, appeared on the covers of major magazines, and became a fixture of the Studio 54 era in New York, a period she still describes fondly when she talks about her career today. Long before Mick Jagger entered the picture, Hall had already built an identity of her own in an industry that chewed people up quickly. She and Jagger, the Rolling Stones frontman, became a couple in 1977, and their relationship would go on to define much of both of their public lives for the next 2 decades. In 1990, on a beach in Bali, they held a Hindu wedding ceremony, a lavish, symbolic union witnessed by friends and family, and treated by the press and the public as their official marriage. Photographs from that day circulated for years afterward as proof of their commitment. Together, they had 4 children: Elizabeth, James, Georgia May, and Gabriel. From the outside, it looked like exactly what it was sold as, one of the great romances of the era. What the public didn't fully grasp at the time was how complicated it actually was behind the scenes, or how legally fragile that marriage really was. Jagger's reputation for infidelity during his years with Hall was not exactly a secret. Tabloids tracked it for years, but Hall herself rarely addressed it directly while the relationship was ongoing. She has spoken since about choosing, for a long time, to keep the family together and to manage things privately rather than air them publicly, a decision common among people trying to protect children from a very public breakup. What is documented, however, is how the relationship ultimately came apart. In the late 1990s, during a Rolling Stones tour, Jagger began a relationship with Brazilian model Luciana Jimenez Morid. Word that Morid was pregnant became public through media coverage, and in 1999 she gave birth to a son, Lucas. Jagger publicly acknowledged paternity. For Hall, by then in her 40s, with 4 children ranging from teenagers to a toddler, this was the point at which 2 decades of managing the relationship privately gave way to a very public reckoning. She filed for divorce in January 1999, citing adultery. At the time, there was widespread reporting that she intended to pursue a significant portion of Jagger's fortune, then estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars, as part of a settlement. This is where the story takes its strangest turn. When Hall's legal team moved to formalize the divorce, Jagger's lawyers raised an argument that reportedly stunned observers at the time. The 1990 Bali ceremony, they said, had never been legally registered, not under Indonesian law, and not under British law. As far as the law was concerned, Jerry Hall and Mick Jagger had never actually been husband and wife. The case went to London's High Court. According to reporting from the time, Justice Sir Michael Connell examined the circumstances of the Bali ceremony and concluded that, because it had never been formally registered and because both parties were not Balinese Hindus, it did not constitute a legally binding marriage under local law. Rather than granting a divorce, the court granted an annulment, a distinction that matters enormously, because an annulment doesn't end a marriage, it declares that no legal marriage existed in the first place. For a woman who had spent more than 2 decades presenting herself publicly and privately as someone's wife, who had given birth to 2 of her children believing exactly that, hearing a court declare the marriage legally non-existent was its own particular kind of blow, layered on top of the infidelity that had brought her to court to begin with. The 2 sides ultimately reached a confidential financial settlement rather than litigating the matter further in public. Details were never fully disclosed, though contemporaneous reporting suggested Hall had sought a sum in the tens of millions of dollars, and that the final settlement was considerably lower. Hall kept the family's home in Richmond and retained resources to raise their 4 children. Both parties, through their lawyers, described themselves at the time as relieved the legal process had reached its conclusion. What came after surprised people who assumed Hall's public identity began and ended with being Mick Jagger's partner. She returned to acting, including a notable stage run in a West End production of The Graduate, a role that drew its own wave of press coverage, separate entirely from anything connected to Jagger. It was, in a sense, a return to a career and an identity she had built well before she ever met him. In 2016, at 59, Hall married media mogul Rupert Murdoch in a ceremony at Spencer House in London, a first legal marriage for her, and a fourth for Murdoch. The wedding drew significant international press attention, not least because of the striking difference in the two men Hall had now been linked to, a rock star known for chaos, and a media executive known for control. That marriage did not last either. Roughly 6 years in, Murdoch and Hall separated. She filed for divorce in 2022, citing irreconcilable differences, and the split reportedly caught even people close to the family by surprise. Unlike her relationship with Jagger, Hall's connection to Murdoch did not carry forward into anything resembling friendship. In interviews since, she's been fairly direct about it. They simply weren't close afterward, and by her own account she hadn't seen him in years following the divorce. She has, however, drawn a clear distinction between the two exes, noting that when children are involved, as they were with Jagger, staying on decent terms tends to matter more. While Hall was rebuilding her life away from the spotlight, Jagger's own personal life took a turn that had nothing to do with her. In the early 2000s, he began a long relationship with American fashion designer Loren Scott, a partnership that lasted roughly 13 years and unfolded with considerably less tabloid turbulence than his years with Hall. Scott built a respected fashion label during that time, dressing figures ranging from Michelle Obama to Naomi Campbell. In March 2014, Loren Scott was found dead in her New York apartment. The medical examiner's office ruled her death a suicide, following what public reporting later described as a period of significant depression and financial strain on her fashion business. Jagger, on tour with the Rolling Stones in Australia at the time, postponed the remainder of the tour and, through representatives, described himself as shocked and devastated. It's a genuinely difficult chapter in this story, and the detail that matters here is simply its impact. It does not require, and this account will not offer, speculation beyond what has already been made public. Later that same year, Jagger began a relationship with ballet dancer Melanie Hamrick, more than 4 decades his junior. The couple had a son, Devereaux, in December 2016, making Jagger a father for the 8th time at 73. Hamrick and Jagger remain together, and by multiple recent accounts have been engaged for several years. This brings the story to where Jerry Hall stands now, weeks from her 70th birthday, living at an estate in Oxfordshire, and speaking with noticeably more openness than she has in the past. In a recent interview with British Vogue, she described a blended family arrangement that would have seemed almost unthinkable during the bitter years of the annulment fight. Jagger, Hamrick, and their young son regularly join her for Sunday lunch. "They're so sweet," she said of the visits, adding that despite years of tabloid speculation to the contrary, she and Jagger simply get on well. That's a notable thing for her to say plainly, on the record, given everything documented above. It doesn't erase the years of managing infidelity quietly, or the sting of a high court ruling that her marriage had never legally existed, or the financial fight that followed. But it does suggest something about how she's chosen to metabolize all of it with time, less through resentment, more through a kind of practical peace, particularly where their 4 adult children and several grandchildren are concerned. Her tone toward Murdoch, by contrast, has stayed noticeably cooler. Asked about the difference, she's pointed to a simple distinction. She and Jagger built a family together over more than 2 decades, while her marriage to Murdoch, 6.5 years with no children, left less holding them together once it ended. Jagger, for his part, has hardly slowed down. In his 80s, he remains the frontman of a band still selling out stadiums, with the Rolling Stones releasing new material and touring in recent years. Hall, meanwhile, has settled into a role she describes with evident enjoyment, doting grandmother, occasional actress, and, after 5 decades in the public eye, someone finally comfortable narrating her own history on her own terms, rather than having it narrated for her by tabloids. What makes this story land the way it does isn't really the annulment, or the settlement figures, or even the infidelity that set the whole legal drama in motion. It's the arc underneath all of it. A woman who spent more than 2 decades in one of the most scrutinized relationships in entertainment, absorbed a legal ruling that technically erased her marriage, rebuilt her life twice over afterward, first alone, then with Murdoch, then alone again, and ultimately arrived, at 70, somewhere closer to peace than resentment. Whether that's forgiveness, practicality, or simply what's left after enough time has passed is something only Jerry Hall can really answer. But she's chosen now to answer it in public, on her own terms, in her own words, after decades of letting other people write the story for her.